Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We're coming back around to the Alignment Guide series based off of a question brought to me by one of our illustrious alumni, a Stephen Ward. Stephen, today's episode goes out to you, buddy, and I'm going to do the best I can to answer your question, though I'll be upfront and admit that the answers are going to be more subjective. And the reason for that is, well, we're looking at what happens when there is a mixing of alignments, particularly when it comes to the other planes of existence. Now, for those of you who may not know, there is more for these kinds of tabletop games. There are more than one realm of existence. Take the world we live in right now, for example, our real world. This would technically be considered, at least in tabletop games like Pathfinder, Rollmaster, Dungeons and Dragons, this would be the prime material plane. The realm of flesh and blood creatures. Creatures who are flesh and blood but carry souls inside of their mortal coils. And the other planes of existence would be places like the ethereal plane, the positive energy plane, the negative energy plane, heaven, hell, Celestia, Acheron, Hades, things like that. The different afterlives are going to be separate planes of existence. Now, with these different planes of existence, they are going to have their own alignments. They'll still follow the 9 alignments we already covered here: lawful good, chaotic good, neutral good, lawful evil, lawful neutral. All 9 of those are represented on the different planes to one degree or another. A plane like heaven is going to be pretty strongly lawful good aligned, whereas the 9 layers of hell, pretty strongly lawfully evil aligned, and the abyss is very powerfully chaotic evil aligned. Well, the chaos is a bit tricky there. The abyss is infinite in its scope, and it has essentially an infinite number of different layers to it, some of which have a finite level of room, whereas other planes or, well, realms in abyss have essentially infinite vast expanses of land and territory that have never and can never be fully explored, because it's the abyss. It's just raw chaos. But you get my meaning. Each of these planes of existence, where different souls may depart to when they die and go on to their respective afterlives, will be going to places that are going to more or less match with their alignments. And these places are going to be, well, again, take heaven. It's lawfully good aligned. Lawful goodly aligned. However you want to put that. It's going to be lawful good in its alignment and scope, because the deity or deities that rule over it, that control it, that have formed and shaped it, are lawfully good aligned themselves. And the beings that they create there are going to be lawful good as well. So the various hosts of angels are going to be lawful good. But unlike mortals, these are not creatures of flesh and blood. They are purely of spirit. They are essence given form and function. They are going to be embodiments of particular aspects of the alignment that they were born under. So demons, devils, angels, archons, axiomites, all these creatures are going to be representations of fundamental aspects of the alignment that they're created under. Some are going to be martially inclined, others are going to be heralds, but they are going to represent, again, fundamental characteristics of the realm or deity that they represent. So they're going to have this fundamental alignment attached to them. And rules as written, these particular realms do not have a lot of overlap. Maybe they border one another, but they don't have a certain amount of bleed that occurs between them with the rules as written. Places where you may see an exception to this are going to be planes like the ethereal plane. It has a pretty close, if not almost one-to-one overlap with the prime material plane. Same with the plane of shadow. And planes like the elemental planes of fire, air, earth, and water are going to have quite a bit of overlap too, but they're also not as strongly aligned as the other planes of existence are. But it does give us the groundwork for possibly making the argument that even though rules as written, the different alignments do not have overlap, and thus would not be able to create creatures that have shared alignment characteristics. These planes do. When the plane on the borders of the planes of elemental earth and elemental fire meet, you get creatures like lava elementals. For earth and water, you get mud elementals, and so on and so forth, with you mixing different elemental varieties. These are creatures still of some physical substance, but there's also that spiritual essence there too. So you could make an argument that with these creatures in particular, maybe because they are physical and spiritual embodiments of the different planes that have had this bleed and overlap over, even though you're going against the rules as written, you could make an argument for different kinds of creatures of total spirit being formed along the borders of different planes of existence. But this is where it gets to be very subjective, because it's not anything that has a strong ruling. In fact, there are rules against it. So individual storytellers, all of you DMs and dungeon masters and whatever you want to call yourselves out there, you're going to be making judgment calls on what these creatures are like and what traits are fundamentally being mixed. Now, certain alignments are going to have plenty in common. For example, lawful good, lawful neutral, and lawful evil. They have a fair bit in common just from the fact that they all make heavy use or are born from particular aspects of law and order. They're going to have that in common with one another. Now, the fine details on how they enforce and go about these particular lawful aspects of themselves are going to differ quite a bit, with lawful neutral being more interested in the exact letter of the law, whatever the exact rulings are, while good will, well, we've talked about this a bit and quite a bit at length in the various other alignment videos. These creatures of total spirit that might be lawful good, lawful neutral, or lawful evil are going to have some fundamental ideas in opposition, just because of the fact that it is inherent to their nature of what they represent. And that is where they're going to clash quite a bit. But say we have a lawful neutral aligned afterlife, and it's bordering on, let's just keep going with heaven as the example, a lawful good realm. They are going to have those lawful aspects already in common with one another. Thus, we have an easier point saying, well, I want to make a ruling that these alignments, these planes, since they border on one another, something's happened to where these fundamental essences are starting to blend and feed into one another along these borders, and it's giving rise to new creatures, new beings. Now, it's a little bit easier for us to make up what these creatures might be, or what their personalities might be, rather, because there's only one step of alignment difference between them, and that's on the good and neutral step of their lawful, neutral, lawful, good alignments. You could make an argument that these creatures, whatever they may be, whatever you might want to call them, you could make the argument that these creatures are still fundamentally, inherently, lawfully aligned, but they're more flexible on that good and neutral territory there. They may be stern, taciturn, very practical enforcers of law, but they are not going to be as remorseless or heartless about it. They may be willing to hear petitioners or whoever they may be overseeing, whoever they may be acting as arbiter for. They may be willing to hear plaintiffs make their case, and they may be swayed by, while this person did break the law, they did not intend for things to get so bad, and clearly they didn't try to make things go so bad, and they even tried to render help and assistance once they realized how bad things had gotten. Normally, a lawful neutral aligned creature from this lawful neutral plane of existence would not be concerned with that. They would not be concerned or swayed by good intentions. They would be concerned wholly and totally only with the letter of the law, whereas lawful good would be concerned about the law, but would be willing to take a look at and consider a creature's intentions and whether or not they tried to render assistance afterwards. They would look at that. They would see the crimes as lesser in the face of the fact that it's not what was intended and the person tried to do good. They tried to make good afterwards. A creature that blends both lawful neutral and lawful good would not be as concerned with the intentions, but would take into account the fact that the creature tried to make up for what they had done wrong. They would be more concerned about that, and they would still enforce the law, but consider a lesser punishment that still fits within the letter of the law. Again, this is where it gets tricky because there are so many ways you could go about this, and it only gets crazier the further away in steps you get from alignments. If you were to try to blend the personality traits of a creature from the abyss, that's chaotic evil, with one from a lawful good alignment oriented plane, they're two diametrically opposed alignments. They share nothing in common any way, shape, or form, and such a creature would probably go mad just because. Let me come up with an example here. Let's take Castiel from Supernatural. Now, spoiler warnings here if you haven't seen it yet. Please duck out now. But Castiel is from heaven, a lawful good aligned plane. He's an angel, so he's a lawful good creature of entirely lawful good essence and spirit. He's an embodiment of heaven's will, of God's will. But as the series goes on, as he spends more and more time on Earth, he doesn't fall like you might say Lucifer or any of the other demons or fallen angels had, but he gains a greater understanding and a deeper appreciation for mortal kind, their plight, their struggles, and not only that, but he gets a certain sense of free will. And with that free will, he just understands the scope of what options are before him, and that he has the freedom to take whatever path in life he chooses. And he tries to bring that to heaven and the other angels, and ends up in a civil war in heaven over it with those who want to see Armageddon take place, and well, the rest who don't and who want to follow Castiel because God's will is for the angels to have a will of their own now. But as time goes on, with that free will, he does not have the certainty of purpose that he had before, because before he was just the embodiment of God's will. Life was much simpler because, well, while not a wholly and totally omniscient being like a deity is, he's still an angel. He still is able to see, comprehend, and understand things on a vast scale that is just incomprehensible to human mind. But because of his time on Earth inhabiting a human body, he got to understand humankind quite a bit more, so he had comprehension and knowledge of these higher things and concepts, but was able to understand and relate to the human and mortal mindset and that aspect of free will. with that loss of certainty of purpose, he gave into a certain amount of despair. Again, I wouldn't say that he had totally fallen. He didn't become evil, but he had that sense of desperation, of hopelessness about him that you might not otherwise find in other lawful good creatures like other angels. So, what it boils down to is these creatures would probably come across as fundamentally much more human just because they're able to embody a broader range of alignment traits. And that's something that comes down particular to humankind, especially in these various tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and Rollmaster, any of them really. Humankind, and I didn't touch on this in the True Neutral episode because it's so easy to muddy the waters, especially with True Neutral, but the bulk of humankind as a whole is not considered lawful good, lawful neutral. They're considered true neutral, not because they see law, evil, chaos, and good as smaller parts of a fundamentally larger whole of a cycle that needs all of these particular pieces moving in order to keep functioning, but because they don't really have time or take the time to consider these larger aspects. And culturally, from place to place, person to person, alignments can differ greatly, although most people will typically fit into whatever cultural mold has been formed. Humans are malleable, day to day, culture to culture, year to year, generation to generation, particularly in comparison to some of the longer lived races who, because they're around for 5 centuries, 1,000 years, or even a couple of millennia, they're around long enough to establish and set down these traditions because, well, humans, we change so fast because our lives are so short, whereas these longer lived races that are around long enough to where, oh, that war was only 1 generation ago. You know, your grandfather's still around. He can tell you exactly what happened. Oh, a couple millennia ago? No problem. Glorfindel over there was around long enough to know what have happened. Actually, just take Elrond as an example from Lord of the Rings. He was around when Isildur had an opportunity to destroy the One Ring. There's these traditions, these cultural mores, these social mores stick around because people were around when they were first formed and started, and the successive generations grow up with that because the older generations just don't die, whereas humankind, by the time the third generation comes around, first generation's probably dead and gone, and the second generation's there. So things, even maybe if to us it's incremental or only bit by bit, things still change faster for humans than they will for longer lived races. And hence that's why humankind tends to be a bit more neutral in its outlook, because month to month, day to day, we can change on our alignment outlooks. We can change in our habits and how we go about things. Whereas these eternal beings, purely of whatever essence, out of whatever planes they were formed from, they are going to more inherently and more strongly embody whatever traits they were born and molded to fit. They are going to be those things utterly, totally, and fundamentally. And any alignment shifts that occur for these creatures are going to be drastic. I mean, take Asmodeus. He fell from the eternal celestial realms of heaven, dropped down, and then ended up forming the 9 hells and started waging war not only against the abyss and continuing that war, but started waging war against the heavenly realms as well. Like I said, I could probably keep talking about this for far too long, but again, it's so inherently subjective and is going to fundamentally depend on what individual storytellers and DMs want to make a ruling on. And the best that I can say is, if you wanted to have these kinds of stories or subjects where the different alignments, the different realms are bleeding into one another, and thus it's giving rise to creatures, non-mortal creatures, who can embody multiple alignment aspects at once. Give it some thought, give it some time, possibly even more time than you might spend on some other things, just because you want this to be, even though you're giving creatures a broader range, spiritual creatures a broader range of personality, you want that to still be somewhat consistent in how you apply it. It may be different from place to place, plane to plane, wherever things are bordering and you have this bleed effect that's giving rise to these different creatures. They may be different place to place, but you want the rulings on it to be consistent. Other than that, like I said, it's entirely up to you, and I can only imagine the kinds of great stories you come up with as you start blending and bleeding these things together, because the rules and the rule books, they're just handy guidelines. Nothing has to stay exactly as written. The important thing is whether or not you and your players are having fun. But with that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. You guys know what to do. Click that subscribe button and have yourselves a good night.